Hi, everyone. We're looking at SIM swap fraud and how you can fight SIM swap fraud with behavioral AI. And this is something that I did not know a lot about. I'd heard about it. We've spoken about it in a few white papers, but I really went down a rabbit hole researching it because I then just started to fear that I'm going to fall victim to SIM swap fraud. And I changed my passwords and have tried to change all my accounts that have my phone number linked to it. So I hope this presentation inspires you to protect your information and it's just insightful. So the main aim of today and what I'm going to take you all through today is just a bit of an overview of what SIM swap fraud is, why it's a very big problem for individuals, for banks, for telcos. We're then going to look at some of the traditional approaches to how people or companies are trying to prevent SIM swap fraud, but also, detect it, and why some of these approaches are unfortunately falling short. And then we're going to get into behavioral AI and why it offers a bit more of a smarter, more intelligent approach. So now to get into it, we're first going to look at what is SIM swap fraud. And this is essentially where someone, a fraudster or a scammer, manages to get a hold of your phone number and convince your network provider to transfer your phone number to a blank SIM on their device that they are in control of. And when I was first reading about this, I'm thinking, why would anyone want my phone number? The only people that actually ever phone me on, my actual phone number, not necessarily WhatsApp, are insurance companies or mom. And I don't really get SMSs. So I was thinking, why does someone want my phone number? And then as I started reading more into it, I realized all my OTPs get sent to my phone number. Anytime I say forgot password, whether it's for an email or a social media account, they say, okay, please confirm that this is you. And they send that OTP to confirm your password change to your phone number. So if someone gets a hold of your phone number, they are really getting a hold of a bit of your digital identity and all your accounts and everything associated with that. And one of those accounts is obviously your bank account, which is a huge problem because they can quite easily say forgot password and have OTP sent to your phone number, which they now have control of. So that's in a nutshell what it is, but there's this whole elaborate process that goes into it. And to give a bit of an overview of what that looks like, it essentially starts off with a fraudster getting a hold of some of your personal information. And we often hear about, I sometimes get an email saying, oh, this password or this account has been in a data leak. They can get a hold of your information through data leaks, through social media, through fake logins, and often phishing. So this person gets a hold of some of your personal information. This person then has a blank SIM card and a device. And then they go to your network provider. Maybe they pick up the phone or they go into the store and interact with a help desk agent, whether that's via the phone or in person. And they essentially attempt to convince this person there that my phone's been stolen or my SIM card's broken and this is my number, which is actually your number. Please, can you port it into this new SIM card? And what's quite interesting about this use case as I was reading more into it is that I can very easily lose my phone or my SIM card can be very easily damaged very easily. So someone coming in and saying, oh, my phone's been stolen and I still want to keep my number, but I need a new SIM card because I've now got a new device and a new SIM card. Please, can you help me out here? It's a fairly normal request and it's a request that customer help desk agents are supposed to be helping people with. But when it gets to the point of verifying who this individual is and that the phone number they are now going to port into this new SIM actually belongs to this person, that's where some of the criminal activity comes in. And essentially what the fraudster or the scammer will use is some form of social engineering to persuade this poor help desk agent that this is the legitimate customer and this phone number belongs to this person, even though they're not actually the right customer. And then they will pass this verification process. They'll prove that this phone number belongs to them, even though it doesn't. And then bam, your phone number is now on their SIM card and they are in control of it. Your SIM card then eventually or immediately stops working and you don't receive any of your phone calls or your SMSs. And then every SMS that you would receive for social media, account login, pins, for OTPs when you're making a transaction or buying something online, banking alerts, whatever it may be, gets sent to this number that you are not in control of anymore. And that is a big problem. Let's start with the person that is the victim of SIM swap fraud. We use our phones for everything, as I mentioned, banking, social media, work emails, personal emails. And when we lose access to our phone number, where that's tied to a lot of these accounts, we lose a lot of kind of control of those different accounts, whether it's social media, email, or in my opinion, worst case scenario, your bank account. If you have a banking app where you can log in and say, forgot password, and they send the OTP to your phone number, and this fraudster has access to that SMS and that OTP, they can log in, change passwords, lock you out, and then clear your accounts. So very dangerous for the individual. For the telco or the mobile operator, it's a huge problem in terms of eroding customer trust and loyalty. Because I was thinking about it, if I had to find out that I've been a victim of SIM swap fraud and someone went into the store claiming to be me, I'm thinking, well, why did you not know it wasn't me? Like, why didn't you protect my identity or protect my number in this case? I would be very annoyed and frustrated as well. And it's really reduced and just has a negative impact on the whole customer experience for that individual. And they are more likely to leave in that instance. Moving beyond just poor customer experience and affecting the customer relationship between the telco and the individual, there's also a lot of operational and investigation costs that go into fraud cases. So they require call center time, fraud investigations, customer support, regulatory reporting, and then often compensation if someone's account has been cleared, or in some instances, let's say it's not a bank account that's been cleared, but maybe this person's managed to buy data. There's also then kind of regulatory exposure. You've got to face, the operators will face liability, regulatory scrutiny, fines, legal action if there's inadequate identity verification methods, security controls. There's all of this involved, and the MNO needs to deal with this. So it's a very big problem for a lot of telcos. But now there's obviously other, I don't want to say victims involved in this whole process, but the one that I do want to look at is banks, because in instances where a SIM swap has occurred, and because this person is receiving OTPs and now this individual is losing money, or their accounts are being cleared, or someone's managed to log in and take control of their accounts, this is a direct financial loss for the bank, because fraudsters can quickly transfer funds. And when money leaves my account, that's my fault. I do expect the bank to please get it back to me, like ASAP. So it's a direct financial loss for the bank, and then it also increases their fraud prevention costs, and they have to invest heavily in operations, investigations, and everything that telco has to go through. The bank also has to go through this for a problem that isn't necessarily something they can control. They don't sell SIM cards. They are not involved in the whole phone number process or porting a number, but this is a massive problem that they have to deal with. So this is obviously a very big issue for individuals, the poor victim who is at the other end of SIM swap fraud, but then also the telcos and the banks. I found that about 5.3 billion Rand is lost annually to telecom related fraud. And what I found most interesting is that anytime there's a mobile banking breach in South Africa, 60% of that is linked to SIM swap attacks. So it is very clearly a massive issue for banks as well. And between 2017 and 2020, there was about a 233% increase in SIM swap incidents. And in the UK, they lose about £5.35 million in losses. They lose that much due to SIM swap fraud. And this was between 2023 and 2024. So it is a big financial burden on banks and telcos as well. So now that we understand a bit about what SIM swap fraud is and why it's a massive problem, and also just some of the insight into what's happening today with SIM swap fraud, I want to look at some of the preventative measures and ways that telcos and banks are also working to detect when SIM swap fraud is happening.
I have a question on I know that a lot of telcos nowadays, when you go get your SIM card, they take like your picture and things like that. So they've got different ways of identifying people. How is it that they don't see that on their system when somebody approaches the customer service person? Like, wouldn't it show up on their system to know that this is not the right person?
Yes, so that is actually one of the points I was going to get to now, in terms of why current prevention methods are falling short, because that is one of the things is where using one of the prevention methods now being introduced as biometric authentication. In South Africa, we have RICA, which is where you have to verify that you are an individual and this number is associated with you, and you have to upload your ID document. So it is a method that is being used, but I'll get to it now, explaining that one, I have never submitted my RICA application, and I started to panic because I was thinking, I don't know if I'm actually verified and associated with this phone number, so anyone can go in and pretend to be me. So that's just one of the examples of why that identity verification is kind of falling short, but it is a method that has been put in place. And yes, I definitely think it is something that gets flagged. You know, if an individual is going into the store claiming to be Madison Hackney, who clearly doesn't look like Madison Hackney, then they are able to flag that and say, we're not giving you this phone number. I'm gonna jump back to, there we go, I'm on the right slide. So the next, so now I'm looking at preventative measures. So the one that we've spoken about is kind of identity verification. So RICA, which I recently learned about, this is essentially a South African law that mandates that all active SIMs have to be linked to an identifiable person. And basically you can do like a digital self-RICA, which is where you can use like your MTN or your Vodacom app, and you can upload your official documents, ID, photos, whatever it may be, and say like, this is me. Or you can do it in store. I myself have not yet done it, and I need to, but I'm sure I will definitely get to it. Then there's also other approaches like account pins and security questions. So I know some cards have like a pin associated with it, and you also sometimes have that pin on your mobile banking, your mobile network app, like for example, the MTN app, that'll sometimes show your PIN. So these are also like security measures that ensure that only you have access to that PIN, and it's a layer of security. But in doing my research, I came across an interview with Johan van Graan and Jeremy Maggs. And Johan van Graan was the former chief risk officer at Vodacom. I think he was there for about 3 decades. And in this interview, he was asked, you know, why is SIM swap fraud such a big issue and why do so many people fall victim to it? And he very bluntly said, it's because we're gullible and we give away our PINs and our passwords. And I was thinking, I mean, are we all that gullible? It's one of the biggest things we hear. Like if someone phones you asking for an OTP or for a PIN or whatever it is, don't give it to them. And then I was thinking back to my poor mother last year. She was actually nearly a victim of SIM swap fraud. It wasn't exactly SIM swap fraud, but she was explaining what happened to me. She was like, she got an SMS saying, and it came from MTN, it looked legit, saying, we suspect SIM swap fraud is about to happen. You're about to receive an OTP. Please send it to us to make sure that we can protect your account. And they then phoned her and said, hi, is this Cheryl? Yes, please, we need the OTP. And she gave it away very freely. And I'm thinking, Mom, this is the first thing we're taught, like, don't give away your PINs. And she was like, but I trusted them and they sounded legit. And even the best of us can fall victim to giving away our PINs. So that kind of shows why sometimes your account PINs aren't the best security measure put in place. Then another approach that I see I have listed here is biometric authentication. And this was essentially what Johan van Graan was talking about in his interview, was that telecom or telco operators now need to introduce this biometric authentication step to ensure that you can accurately identify that this is the person that this number belongs to prevent SIM swap fraud. He brought up that it's working really well in banking, in the banking space at the moment. I forgot my password for my banking app a few weeks ago, and when I said forgot password, next thing I know, it says, okay, take a pic, say cheese. And you have to go through this like biometric authentication to make sure that this is Madison logging into the account and saying she's forgot her password. We can help her reset it. It's not someone who's managed to get a hold of her phone. So these are some of the approaches that work, but there are still a few weak spots to them, like poor gullible people giving away their OTPs. Now, there's another approach that I want to look at, or another common preventative measure or detection measure that has been put in place for quite a while, and that is rule-based detection using a rule-based engine. So to understand, as we get later into this presentation, why behavioral AI, or why we want to bring in behavioral AI as a solution to replace this, it's really helpful to understand how a rule-based engine actually works. So what's important to look at is that, or to note, is that a rule-based engine doesn't learn from data, it doesn't necessarily recognize any patterns, and it doesn't understand any customer behavior. It essentially evaluates a set of rules. If this happens, do that. And these rules are all determined by fraud analysts. So us as humans, people, experts, will come up with an event that looks like fraud and then say, okay, if this event happens, this is what needs to be done. So for example, a few of them would be like, If a SIM was replaced in 24 hours, in the past 24 hours, flag the account. If more than 3 SIM swaps have occurred in the past 30 days, flag the account and block the request and then notify the customer, something along those lines. In the case of, if we look at kind of a holistic issue of banking and telcos working together, if a SIM swap occurs within 24 hours and a transaction amount of higher than X is requested, or a transfer amount, block the request. And this specific rule, when I was doing my research, got me thinking, because I was looking at this issue of SIM swap fraud, thinking this is a telco issue. How does the bank know, okay, there's a transfer request? How on earth would they know if a SIM swap has occurred? They can't necessarily have a full, a bird's eye view into this whole picture or process that's happening. They only necessarily see the transaction amount or the transfer amount, but actually they do. I looked into it. So there's a process where a mobile operator will process a SIM swap and they will alert the bank via secure APIs. There's kind of like a shared or integrated database that they have. And in this instance, the bank can kind of temporarily freeze or flag or alert specific transactions that are occurring when they know, okay, a SIM swap has taken place. And I read about this in a PwC article, and they were saying that there's been a recent introduction of this shared intelligence in India. So the Department of Telecommunications has introduced India's financial risk indicator. And what this essentially aims to do is that telco providers will send risk signals to financial institutions in the instance of things like SIM swap fraud taking place. So yeah, sorry, that was just a little bit of a pivot into how banks and telcos can kind of work together. But I've painted this picture of, how a rule-based detection or rule-based engine works to detect SIM swap fraud. But the problem, or a couple of the main problems with this approach, is that these solutions worked, but they don't necessarily change until a human decides to change them. And the problem with that is that once a fraudster understands the rules, they can simply work around them. So, for example, if the rule is SIM swap has occurred, don't allow any transactions above a certain amount, then what do? They just do 2 smaller transactions. Or if it's a case of SIM swap has occurred, wait 24 hours before a password reset can take place. Then the fraudster just waits 24 hours. So there's loopholes and ways to work around these issues. And once people learn the rules and they work around them, the kind of rule-based engine that helps detect fraud becomes kind of obsolete. So that's one of the problems with a rule-based detection system. But there is another problem, which I'm going to get a little bit more into, that then shows why behavioral AI is such an effective approach. Rule-based engines don't necessarily look at the whole relationship or the patterns between these events that are occurring holistically. It simply compares, an incoming event, and then it compares that event against a rule and then executes a corresponding action. It doesn't necessarily look at the whole picture. So you can see, okay, SIM swap has occurred. SIM swap has occurred. That in itself is just an event that is perfectly normal. But if we look at SIM swap has occurred in a different location, a transaction has been requested above a certain amount, it doesn't necessarily look at all of these events happening together. And hence it's not as effective in detecting, SIM swap fraud when there's a series of events happening. So, but that is one of the main problems that I want to point out here with this system, is that a rule-based engine doesn't necessarily notice the patterns between events. Another issue that I want to point out, which I'll also get into in the behavioral AI section, is that a rule-based engine only really produces a binary decision. It either matches the rule or it doesn't. So there's not really a kind of a probabilistic view of, this is 60% fraud or 90% fraud or whatever it may be. It says fraud, not fraud, and then delivers the intervention. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about why that isn't the most effective way of preventing or detecting SIM swap fraud. So I have unpacked SIM swap fraud, I've unpacked what it entails, why it's a big problem, and some of the approaches that are used to detect and to prevent it. And we've seen that some of these aren't the most effective. So for example, biometric verification works, and it's great to have in place if someone has a device that has a biometric verification or biometric authentication capability or function. If the device doesn't have that, then you can't really implement that, and it leaves those people exposed. In some instances, RICA is quite painful and inconvenient to set up. And in examples like me, I haven't done it. So that step in, verifying who someone is isn't necessarily put in place. And it's also inconvenient for the customer. They don't really like going through that. And then it puts a little bit of a dampener on the whole customer experience. And then lastly, we've gone through the rule-based system for detecting fraud, and we've seen that there are few problems associated with this approach. So with these attempted solutions that have varying levels of success, what is the solution to these problems? Or what is the solution to the problems associated with these other solutions? This is then where I want to unpack behavioral AI and look at where behavioral science and machine learning comes together. And so, introducing behavioral AI. So behavioral AI is quite a complex topic, and there's a lot of detail and a lot of nuance to it that unfortunately, or not unfortunately, fortunately, I'm still on the path to fully understanding it. But here is what I have come to understand about the topic of behavioral AI. We have two disciplines. We have behavioral science, number one, and behavioral science essentially allows us, or is the way we aim to understand why people do what they do. So it'll draw on disciplines like psychology and economics, sociology, cognitive science, and it'll give us theories to explain why people have certain habits or biases, motivations, or goals. This is just my general overview. So we have behavioral science. We then also have machine learning. And what machine learning is really good at doing, that us humans unfortunately aren't, is learning or analyzing vast amounts of information. And this information is most likely what we call, not most likely, it's what we call historical data. And what it's really good at doing is identifying patterns and relationships between different little bits of nuggets of information in that historical data that we just can't detect. And it's too much for humans to work through. So within that information, it detects patterns and it learns the mathematical relationship between these different, I call them nuggets of information, but they're actually called features in that historical data. And then it looks at how does the relationship between these features then result or relate to a particular outcome or a behavior. So to take what I've just explained, I'm going to just give a bit of an example in a telco setting that doesn't necessarily relate to fraud. So if we look at an MNO like MTN or Vodacom or Orange, Horizon, whatever it may be around the world, they will have vast amounts of data about their customers. And some of this data consists of events. So things like making a phone call, logging into the app, streaming music, making a top up, buying a SIM plan, changing a SIM, swapping SIMs, or in some instances leaving and requesting to not be a customer or complaining, things like that. These events that all sit in this data set. There's also other pieces of information that help describe or add more detail to that information or to those events. So things like how long has this customer been with us? What device type do they use? What locations do they typically log into the app from? What time of day do they typically do this? We often talk about time, place, and act as features that we look at. So if someone's done something, they've made a purchase, where are they doing it and when, how often, what time of day, what day of the week, what day of the month, all of that. So together, all this information becomes features that the machine learning model analyzes. So in my head, anytime I see the word feature, I'm thinking it's just a little nugget of information. So all this information, all these features is what the machine learning model analyzes. So looking at this historical information, we have features and events. We also have specific information about those features and events. And then we have like an outcome of what has happened. We've got, did someone make a purchase, request a new SIM? Did they leave? Did they, complain? Something. And now we need to find patterns within patterns or, kind of a relationship in these little nuggets of information that led to this event occurring. And once we know the combination of those events and the pattern, and we then know that led to this outcome, we then know how to intervene. And we then see where behavioral science really plays an important role in this whole machine learning process. And it's the fact that behavioral science explains why these patterns exist. So we have a relationship between these different events that led to an outcome, and now we want to intervene either to prevent that outcome from happening. So if it's in the case of churn and we don't want the customer to leave, we want to intervene and say, no, stay with us. If we want them to buy something or top up, make a purchase, maybe we want them to do a little bit sooner, or maybe we want them to buy a little bit more than they usually do. We want to upsell or cross-sell. And we need to know how to intervene. So behavioral science then comes in because it explains why these patterns exist, or why this relationship between these different events occur or exist. There is like evidence within those events that indicate some type of behavior, and we then want to understand why there is this behavior, so we will apply a behavioral science approach or theory to it. And for example, in the instance of if someone's run out of data or about to run out of data and they want to top up, there may be this fear of not having data. I don't want to lose out. And in this instance, we could apply, a behavioral science theory like loss aversion. Again, I'm not the behavioral science expert, but there are a whole bunch that Jace actually took me through a couple days ago that we were looking at. So really interesting topic, which we will add to the meetup calendar. The point is that we can explain what's happening through the lens of a behavioral theory. Then from that, okay, we know that this person tops up their data because they don't want to lose out. We then know, okay, well, how can we intervene to influence a specific outcome? So if we want them to buy data or make a top up, and we know they typically make a top up when they don't want to run out and they are loss averse, instead of simply saying, buy a weekend data bundle today, we can say something that relates a little bit more to the reasoning as to why they are topping up or would like to top up, which is loss aversion. So we can say something like, don't miss your weekend streaming, or top up now before your data runs out. Something, again, I'm not the expert when it comes to message writing, but something that is a little bit more behaviorally driven and actually relates or connects to why this person behaves the way that they do. So that is just a picture and an example of how behavioral science and machine learning works together to obviously form behavioral AI, and then how it can be applied in a telco setting in an example that isn't necessarily fraud. But there's one thing that I've taken away from all of this in my reading and my understanding, and something that I always come back to when I'm giving a presentation on use cases. And it's that one thing behavioral AI definitely and always enables a business to do is to better understand individual customers. A customer's behavior is one of the clearest expressions of their preferences, their habits, their motivations, and their decision making. And if we can analyze patterns in that behavior through those little nuggets of information, if we can find the evidence of behavior in that data and then interpret that through the lens of behavioral science, we as a business, a telco, a bank, whatever it may be, can gain a much deeper understanding into who each customer is, what motivates them, and how likely they are to respond in different situations. And what's really important about this deep understanding of the customer, is that you can establish a behavioral baseline for how customers typically interact with you. We can look at things like where they typically log on, what channels they typically use. Do they work through the app, or do they work entirely through, the online portal on your laptop? I never log into my bank via my laptop. I only ever do it on my app. And that's just how I am. That's my behavior or my habits and patterns. And I would ideally like my bank to know that about me. So there's so much that you can kind of understand in this rich profile that you can create about a customer and how they prefer to interact with you, whether it's, do they use the app or the online portal? What channels do they use? How often are they making purchases? In a telco situation, how often are they topping up? What plans do they have? How often do they engage with us or respond? We can get this really amazing understanding of who this individual is. And from that baseline, we can then detect meaningful changes in their behavior. We can see if they're suddenly spending more or suddenly interacting through a channel that isn't necessarily where they always do. And when you recognize this change in behavior, we can also start as a business to recognize if this customer is developing a new need, if maybe they're losing interest, or if they're becoming at risk of churn. Or in the case of this use case, we can see if they are behaving in a way that suggests fraud. We can see that they are behaving in a way that deviates from so much from who they are that we can flag this as fraud. So bringing this back to the use case that we're looking at, which is SIM swap fraud. We've looked at how, a combination of events that the machine learning model has analyzed and detected that a combination of events can lead to a specific outcome. We can then explain why that outcome happens, or the relationship, why this pattern exists through the lens of behavioral science, and explain why it occurs. We then know how to intervene. We've also then used behavioral science to better understand how a person is behaving and why it leads to this outcome. And from that picture of behavioral AI, it then draws back to the main problem that I was talking about earlier with rule-based engines in detecting fraud. And it's that the current methods, the current approach to detecting fraud using a rule-based system is that it looks at things in isolation. It doesn't necessarily look at all these events holistically. Second is that not just looking at these events holistically, or it doesn't look at any of the events holistically, it doesn't look or answer the question, do these events that are happening holistically, is this normal for this customer? Is this how they typically behave? Does this combination of events seem strange, or is it in line with their kind of baseline behavioral profile? So for example, every customer has a different behavioral profile or behavioral baseline. So as I mentioned, I can use either my Telco app or my banking app every day. I log in from my home in London, let's say. I spend £500 a month on groceries. I transfer my salary into my savings account at the end of every month, or whatever's left over. I top up with data only on a Friday for the weekend, because that's typically when I run out of data, and I do it in the evening after work. That's typically how I behave and how I interact. And our telco has managed to extract some form of information and understanding of how I behave, and they have this profile on me. One day they suddenly see that I log in from another country, or I've changed my SIM card. We're in a SIM swap use case. I've changed my SIM card. Now I'm logging into my app from a strange device that I don't use, from a completely different country. I have maybe logged into my banking app now and requested a password reset. All of these actions, all of these events occurring don't necessarily indicate fraud. It's quite normal for someone to log into to travel and go to another country and then log into their app from that country. It's normal for people to change their card. It's normal for people to make transfers to accounts that they haven't necessarily transferred to before. But a combination of all these events, first of all, may indicate some form of fraud, but also for me and how I typically behave, definitely could indicate fraud. So what's important is that because all these events in combination reflect a kind of significant deviation from how I typically behave, it's then easier to flag this event and say, this is suspicious. So behavioral AI is able to detect that change within the context of this individual, rather than relying on a set of, fixed rules that don't necessarily relate to that person. So, for example, I mentioned, in the rule-based system that if, a SIM swap has occurred within 24 hours, you flag the account or prevent transactions or block transactions. So I've discussed, a deviation from my behavior that shows how I behave typically, and now these events that we're seeing and that the machine learning model is able to pick up on is a deviation from how I typically behave, and then we can flag that as fraud. There's an important aspect here that we also get from behavioral AI and machine learning, is that the fraud is flagged as a probability. So for example, I've mentioned how I typically behave. Now in this instance, my SIM's been replaced. I'm logging on from a completely different device in a completely different known location at 600 kilometers from where I typically am. I'm requesting a password reset, even though I've never done that, and I'm logging on at a time of day that I never log on to my banking app. All of this together says, okay, this is not how Madison typically behaves. There's a 96% chance that this probability, or 96% chance that this is a SIM swap fraud and an account takeover. And this is where that probability becomes really important, because as I mentioned earlier, rule-based systems or a rule-based engine kind of has a binary answer, fraud, not fraud. And there's then only like an intervention, block the account or flag the account, whatever it may be. There's only one. But in this instance, where we're looking at probability, it allows businesses to intervene, whether it's a telco or bank, differently based on the probability that has been decided. And the reason that this is so important is because as I've mentioned before, some people behave differently. We all behave differently. So what looks like a 96% chance of fraud for me may actually be a regular Tuesday for someone else. So take, for example, someone who travels fairly often and they say they go to the UK once every 3 months. They often change devices. They have 2 phones. They use one for work, one for personal. And when they're in the UK, they take both phones. Often when they get there, they get a new SIM, but they like to keep their old number. Maybe they open up an eSIM, whatever it may be, and they use their old number while they're in this new country or while they're in the UK working there. And anytime they are there, they transfer some of their money into a bank account based in the UK so that it's easier to transact. That looks suspicious. But for someone else that it does happen and it is a fairly common activity, or it's common for how they behave, this doesn't necessarily look like fraud. In my instance, it looks like there's a 90% chance that this is fraud, but for the other individual, there's a lower probability, let's say 60%. It's a little bit out of the norm, but it's not drastic. It's not a drastic deviation. So in this case, we can then flag it and say, okay, it's about 60% chance of SIM swap fraud, or that there's suspicious activity going on. And with that lower probability, or these varying levels of how we decide how to flag a case of fraud, we then can intervene differently. So in my case, if this definitely looks like fraud and it's 96% chance, block the account, block all requests, and make sure no money leaves my account, because this clearly looks like fraud. But in the instance of the person who, it looks fairly regular, it's just a little bit out of the norm, let's just give them a call. And it draws back to, when I was looking at the rule-based engine approach, is that it doesn't really give you that holistic view and that insight into who this customer is and how they behave. And now with this behavioral approach, not only do we have a view into how they behave, what's normal for them, we now also have a better understanding of how to intervene and interact in instances where there is fraud. So I've looked at, SIM swap fraud, what it is, the problems, different approaches, and now I've taken you through the behavioral AI approach and how it plays a really important role in improving fraud prevention and detection methods, specifically for telcos, but then also, for instances for banks as well. So we've looked at how you can look at relationships, or how machine learning models can analyze the relationship between events holistically. We've looked at being able to understand the customer holistically through the lens of behavioral science. We've taken this into a probabilistic perspective and understood that what looks like a clear case of fraud for me is not a clear case of fraud for someone else. And because we understand these customers, because we've been able to see who they are and how they typically behave, we now know how to intervene. And in those instances, we've then been able to very clearly prevent the negative effects of SIM swap fraud if it's, block the request or block transactions. But in the instance where, it looks like a lower chance of fraud, we've also been able to just double check and inform them that this is going on without necessarily taking the extreme precautions of blocking their account and inconveniencing them. So from that approach, from this behavioral AI approach, there are obviously several improvements. So the one thing I always want to look at is the customer experience. So number one, you've protected an individual who has been exposed to SIM swap fraud, and you've blocked the request, done what the telcos needed to do to protect this customer. And in the instance where it isn't SIM swap fraud, you've made sure you haven't inconvenienced another customer. You've also reduced regulatory exposure. So if you detected earlier that this is a case of SIM swap fraud and you prevent all the negative effects from, rolling on, you then reduce your regulatory exposure and you have fewer incidents reports. You aren't necessarily entirely liable, all of that. But now there's one point that I spoke about much earlier on when we looked at why it is a problem, is that there's huge operational costs that go into managing fraud for a telco and also for a bank. And the thing that I want to draw on here when we look at operational costs is the ability to have, I don't want to say one tool, but yes, a tool that gives you that holistic view of a customer, who they are, how they behave, what is that normal behavioral baseline that we often talk about. And my aim wasn't really to, bring in us and what we do and talk about the prediction platform. I really just wanted this to be a conversation about, the overall problem and behavioral AI as an approach to solving it. And we obviously are behavioral AI experts. That's what we specialize in at Ecosystem AI. But We as a business and our platform and what we do, we always talk about the importance of knowing your customer. And I feel like anytime I talk about use cases where it's really important to know your customer, I come at it from a perspective of, how can you make more money? We talk about making money, saving money, and protecting money. And I often talk about how can you make smarter recommendations? Like how can you upsell? How can you cross-sell? How can you give better financial advice? My favorite use case is to talk about credit card activations. How can you get a customer tapping on their credit card? And these use cases where you take that deep understanding of your customer often result in making some more money for the business, for the bank or the telco, whatever it may be. And that is part of our narrative and what we talk about when we talk about making, saving, and protecting money. But on the other end of the spectrum, having a deep and profound understanding of your customer isn't just so that you can sell more to them and extract more value. It's also about knowing when to protect them. It's about knowing, what we're seeing right now is a deviation from how this person typically behaves. We need to flag it. We see that there could be a case of fraud here. How can we protect this customer and ensure that that relationship stays safe and they trust us and they stay loyal? Because loyalty isn't just about, when times are good and I can buy more products and I can buy more data. It's also about when times are bad and I'm at risk of exposure here. And I want my telco or my bank, whatever it may be, to know who I am as a customer and know what it takes to protect me. And in this case, if you are protecting the individual and you are not dealing with the financial loss of fraud and having to go through all the operational, regulatory, and financial exposure and all of that, those difficulties, there's obviously a reduced cost for the business. So not only are you protecting the individual customer, you're also protecting money for the telco. Are there any questions?
Lots of questions, but because we're running out of time and I also have to jump to another meeting, have you come across some disadvantages of using behavioral AI? Because I know that personally, like the experience I had, it wasn't that I hadn't done the RICO thing, but it was that I had traveled, and then because I traveled for longer than that roaming period or whatever it is, they basically gave away my number without even calling me to check on me. And so now once they'd given away my number, it's like I could not use my phone anymore because now I was too scared because of all those, things connected to the actual mobile phone number. And even before that, all of my tendencies were different because I traveled to a country that was just completely different. So the way I was acting was very different from usual. So even if they had behavioral AI, they actually would have thought I was, so I'm wondering whether you guys have come across any negatives and how you actually incorporate that.
Yes. Thank you for that, Chris. That is actually something that I did in my reading. I can't answer this question 100%. I'm going to hand over to Jay. You don't own your number. They just kind of rent it like a license. So and in some of the prevention methods or what people were suggesting is that you actually have to phone and say to your telco, oh, I'm leaving for X amount of time. Please don't give my number away. I have heard that as an issue. But in terms of you're talking about behaving very differently when you're in this other country, I think Jay can give some more insight into, I want to say, the downsides of behavioral AI or how it works with travel.
Yeah, I think the downside is just that you might have interpretation differences based on how people shift their behaviors. But the challenge with the losing number problem is that to keep a SIM on the network means that you need to have a way that you can connect to that network. So if you travel for more than 3 months, so most telcos will have a 90-day period that you just have to connect to the network to retain your number. And that's what you'll find that some people do. They might even buy a text message bundle, for $2 or whatever it might be every 90 days, just so that they can retain their number if it's not on contract. If your number is on contract and you pay monthly, then you don't have to connect to the network at all for months at end. So that's, I think, a different problem than the behavioral question that you have. So on the behavioral side, I think the interpretation of your behaviors that are exhibited that are out of the norm is a common challenge for us to assess and to figure out. And I think that using archetypal theory and behavioral science, you try and find the degree of variation that is typically present within a certain set of interactions. And that is something that's still more reliable than doing a pure rule-based approach. Is basically the principle.